Right in the middle of this group of mounding habit shrubs is the evergreen azalea, which I got to say I really like evergreen azaleas. They're pretty common. A lot of people consider them overplanted and sort of ho-hum, but they do a real good job, which is to say they're relatively small, they're evergreen, they have pretty flowers in the spring, they're tough, and some of them even get little tints of red in the fall. So if you need something to look good all year long that doesn't get too big, I highly recommend the evergreen azalea. It's also extremely malleable. It can be thinned and opened up to be more delicate looking. You can reduce the size pretty easily with the reduction cut. If you have need, you can renovate it by whacking it way, way back and letting it grow. And should all else fail, and it's still too big for the spot, they are a dream to transplant. Here's a picture of some evergreen azaleas. Can't beat that. This is a Japanese garden that I take care of. And for me, these low plants are what's needed in gardens. We tend to have lots of things in the Pacific Northwest that are in the sort of 10 to 15 foot range, and it can be quite overwhelming. But if you put in enough lower story, that is to say plants that max out under 5 feet, your landscape becomes much more welcoming. And one way to do that is to put in evergreen azaleas. Here's a picture of some evergreen azaleas. These are just some plain old Hino crimsons, and they are underneath a crabapple. They often bloom at the same time. Crabapple is a small tree, and it deserves a small shrub as understory. If this were mine, I would dig them up and spread them out so that they matched the width of the crown. These matched the width of the crown when they were planted about 20 years ago. Anyway, quite lovely. Wrong pruning for evergreen azaleas and pretty much everything else is shearing. I got to tell you that occasionally they shear evergreen azaleas in actual Japanese formal gardens, but they know what they're doing, and it's not for the general public. Don't try this at home, because you might get something that looks like this. If you shear your azalea at the right time of year, you get more blooms. If you shear it at the wrong time, it looks like this. Looks like it's having an outbreak of something. And it's considered tacky. So even though it's tempting to shear evergreen azaleas, it's much less work and much better for the plant if you selective prune it. What do I mean by less work? The problem with shearing is you get an upsurge of regrowth every time you make that heading cut, which is what shearing is, and you lock yourself into a battle against your plant, spending most of the time trying to get rid of the water sprouts that you created when you just went out one day with the head shears and thought of yourself as Art the Plant Shaper. And when you shear azaleas, and just naturally, they develop deadwood. And in fact, the main thing that pruners do is take out deadwood. It's little black pieces of brittle wood on the inside of your shrub or tree. It develops naturally as the tree or shrub grows up, and it's sort of like housework, except that housework makes me crabby. Deadwooding makes me calm. Deadwooding always makes things look better. It doesn't count against the pruning budget, and it is what you should be doing most of with your evergreen azalea and pretty much everything else. Here's some deadwood inside an evergreen azalea, and you'll be able to spot it. Just go outside, look inside your evergreen azalea. There it is. And you can snap it out. You can actually kind of crunch it out with your hands. It's so brittle. And then go back in and cut off every little tiny stub that you left, a little sharp bit. And the finished product looks so much better. This is my illustrator's picture of somebody crunching out the deadwood. Crunch, 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 crunch. When landscapers' budget is running out, they underbid the job, and they only have a little bit of time left. They'll just run through and crunch out all the deadwood of the azaleas because they can do it really fast, and it makes a big difference in how things look. The other thing about evergreen azaleas is every once in a while they send up a really long, overextended branch. Marion Benetti, our columnist here in the Pacific Northwest, calls them puppy dog tails. Let's see, there's the puppy dog tail. And you do not want to just head them back to no place in particular, to the perimeter of the shrub, because we know that is a non-selective heading cut, and you will just get water sprouts. Here's a picture of them. You can see the ones sticking up beyond the perimeter. You don't want to just cut those off to the perimeter. You want to follow them down inside the plant until they meet up with a side branch. The two cuts that look like Band-Aids, those are wrong cuts. You want to follow it down to where it meets up with the parent stem. And in many cases, you can reduce the size of your evergreen azalea just using what I call the grab and snip technique, and get about, say a quarter to a third of size reduction, depending on the plant. Some plants, there's just nothing to cut back to, but other ones you can reduce the size. You'll know when you're out there looking at it. You find the branch that sticks out the most, follow it down somewhere inside the plant where it meets up with the parent stem or a side branch, and cut it off there. You do that all over your shrub, and it will be smaller, but it will be natural looking. It will bloom profusely no matter when you do this operation. It doesn't matter what time of year when you are selective pruning. What are you going to do if you have already made a couple of mistakes and you sheared your evergreen azalea into a box, a cube, a hockey puck, or a gumdrop? Well, the news is good. The reason evergreen azaleas are in the slideshow called Easy Plants to Prune is because they're easy to prune generally, and they're easy to fix if you've made a couple of mistakes. What you do is you want to get it up off the ground by cutting off all the branches that hang down and get it more into sort of a chevron shape, and then grab and snip, taking out the worst clustered ends to open it up, break up that shell. And you do that for a couple of years in a row, and you will have a natural looking shrub again. Renovation pruning is okay too. What do I mean by renovation pruning? Well, I actually call it radical renovation. I used to just call it renovation, but I was afraid of what people would do. Renovation pruning is when you cut a plant to a very low framework, maybe 4 inches from the ground, and let it regrow. And this is one way that you can rehab a previously malpruned, which is to say sheared shrub. It is pretty tough on the plant, and it won't last because it will grow back quite quickly to the size it was before, which brings the question, why on earth would you do this thing? Well, it's just nice to know how far you can push your plants for special reasons. For example, if you had a whole row of evergreen azaleas that were lopsided because there was a hedge over them and they were reaching for the sunlight, and you cut down and stump ground out that hedge, and now it could see daylight all over, but it was still lopsided, you could just whack the heck off of that side and it would flush back all over and be equal on all sides. I had a customer who had a bank of evergreen azaleas, nice mature evergreen azaleas, and they were around some trees and some other shrubs, but it was right next to a little patio hung off a tiny wall and crowded a patio that was in her backyard, and it went to the door. The patio went to her back door, and there was a canopy there behind the azaleas at the back door. Oh, well, first I would just prune them to make them look better. Mainly I would create space between them and the trees and them and the other larger shrubs. And I also undercut it where it was hanging off the little wall so that it didn't stick so far out into the patio. That worked for a few years, but then eventually she said, Cass, I really want you to just cut them way, way back. They're just bothering me. They're so big. And I said, well, okay, but don't tell anybody. You can't tell on me. And just sort of as an experiment, I took out my loppers and I cut them to about, I would say 6 to 8 inches off the ground, making cuts as big around as my thumb, sometimes as big around as 2 fingers. And I did that in the spring, which is a kind season. And I told her that she couldn't blame me if everything died. But I came back later in the year and it had all grown back and it looked great and it bloomed fine the next year. So that was a living learning experience. But I got to tell you that in only 3 years, they were too big for her again, at which point we took out the awning that was outside her back door, and her patio seemed bigger, and we could leave it alone. So just so you know, if you have a good reason to whack back your evergreen azalea, you can do that, and it will probably work. Radical renovation is what it's called, and Cass said it's okay if you do it in the spring and you are mentally prepared that it might die instead of growing back. Generally, they don't, but it is a big blow to the health of a plant. And renovation should not be done every year. That would be crazy. You want to do it maybe once every 15 years for a particular reason. If your evergreen azalea is really too big or it's being swamped out by a rhododendron planted over it, you should know that they are just a dream to move. They practically have wheels, and you can just rearrange it any place you want so that it has more room to grow up and do its job and look great. If you're a professional, you can carry plants from the stem. If you're a homeowner, you have to carry them from the root ball. It's just a little joke. But evergreens and azaleas have pancake-like root systems, and those root balls don't fall apart. They hardly even know they are out of the ground.